Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Fridays with Vistage webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some items to help you participate in today's webinar. If you are experiencing technical difficulties joining the webinar session, please dial support at 1-888-259-8414. When you joined today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Please note that a PDF of today's presentation is available for download on your control panel, and a recording of this presentation will be sent to all attendees via email within the next week. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Bill Black.
Welcome to Fridays with Vistage. My name is Bill Black. I'm a Vistage member and speaker and your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar title is In the Culture Struggle, Your First Move Should Be. An organization that's been in business for more than 5 minutes has a culture. Whether or not it's a culture that's needed to be successful is one of the most important decisions an organization can make. Having the culture you need must be more important than having the culture you want. After completing this webinar, you'll know the answers to the following questions. How do you know the first question to ask to determine the culture needed? You'll know your organization's answer to that question. You'll know the elements necessary to have the culture you need, and you'll know the element to start with to get to the culture you need. Our speaker today is Sharon Dye, and Sharon is currently a human capital consultant with Insperity, where she helps clients define their goals, overcome roadblocks, and improve overall organizational performance. Sharon has utilized a common sense approach to consulting for 27 years to help clients identify core issues and appropriate solutions. She has the proven ability to turn consulting theory into practical, actionable plans. Her reputation for hearing what isn't being said, reframing perspectives, and being tactfully direct has earned her the nickname of CEO Whisperer. She has been an executive coach to leaders of organizations in the early months of startup, as well as leaders of organizations that have existed for decades. Her talent for quickly assessing issues and best solutions is particularly suited to helping companies impacted by reorganization, restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, leadership changes, and corporate culture challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, Sharon Dye.
Hello, everyone. Bill, thank you so much. I'd love to just dive right in and get going. We don't have a whole lot of time to cover a very big topic. And what we're going to talk about today, as Bill has mentioned, is getting clearer around what we mean when we say culture is a matter of need, not want. We're going to talk about the culture needed to be successful in the organization's marketplace, and then how do you determine what it is that you need when it comes to your organization's culture. Before we unpack all of that, I want to set up a couple of frameworks here for us that will help guide us through the conversation. And part of what's going to guide us is the wonderful quote from Peter Drucker, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And in my experience, sometimes it nibbles and sometimes it inhales. And mostly what happens is that culture tends to nibble away at the strategy. Organizations don't typically go out of business or lose market share overnight. It's something that happens in increments, bits and pieces, maybe an inch at a time and then a whole foot at a time and then back to an inch at a time. But culture is nibbling away at strategy when you don't have the culture that you need. And again, we'll say more about that in just a few moments. One of the last frameworks I'd like for us to discuss before we start unpacking the topic of culture that's needed is behavior equals person times the culture. That's the slide that you're looking at now. And this is one of the pieces of work that came from Dr. David McClelland out of Harvard. David spent about 40 years doing research around the world at what motivates people. And one of the things he discovered is that when you try to figure out what is it that creates the environment of the organization, or in our language, the culture, you need to look at two things. you need to look at that it's the individual person plus the culture that you have that's going to determine how the people behave. And the reason I'm bringing that up for this conversation is because most organizations spend an inordinate amount of time trying to get the P part of this formula, the person, changed. We have expansive IDP programs, individual development plans, and we spend a whole lot of time trying to change someone to behave in a certain way. And my experience is that that is more often than not a lot of time that's misused and typically gets low or little of the desirable result. If the time is spent on making sure we have the culture we need, and then we recruit to that culture, we by default have paid attention to what David discovered, and that is, if I've got the people that we need for the culture that we need, people will behave in such a way that will go right back around and continue to create the strong culture that we need. And now we have all things in harmony. I think this will make even more sense as we move forward. For the moment, I just want to make sure that we're paying attention to the amount of time being spent is more on the culture, less on trying to change an individual to be or behave in a way that isn't particularly natural to them. As all of us may have discovered at some point in our life, we can try and change a husband to wife, a daughter, a boss, a brother, a sister, a cousin, or a neighbor. Usually doesn't work well. We just need to focus on the culture. So what does that mean for us? Well, for our purposes in our conversation today, I want us to make sure that we're thinking through a system mindset rather than an individual mindset. And if we link these two slides together and we go back a step rather than forward a step, if we go back to this, an individual mindset would be focusing on the P of this formula, and a system mindset would be focusing on the C of the formula. We're focusing on the culture. It's the whole system working together to ensure that we do what we need to do in the marketplace. All right, the bottom line of culture is that your current strategy will have an impact on this year's bottom line, but your culture will have an impact on next year's bottom line. All of this is getting at what is the deep value of culture. It's making sure that year after year you are accomplishing what it is you intend to accomplish in the marketplace. Okay, now we're going to dive much deeper into the topic of culture and getting at what we promise we do in this webinar, which is helping you figure out what is the culture that we need. And the work that we are using, which you can, I think, see at the bottom of the slide there, the name William Schneider. Dr. Schneider spent about 15 years researching, does culture have an impact on bottom line? Bill started in this work about 45 years ago, and part of what he discovered is that there are three elements in every enterprise, in every organization. The three elements that we're going to talk about today is customer promise, culture, and leadership. And one of the things that Bill discovered is that if you, in trying to figure out the culture of your organization, if you start with answering the question, so what culture do we want? You've started in the wrong place. What Bill's research found is that you need to start by answering the question, what is our customer promise? What is it at the core we're promising our customer? In other words, if we stop doing X, fill in the blank, our customers will leave. Everything you do, and everything there is in all capitals because I mean everything you do must be tied to how you answer the question, what we're promising our customer is. And once you answer the question, we're promising our customer X, then you have by default, according to Bill's research, determined the culture that you need. Let me unpack that a little bit more. Let's start by building some 4 quadrants and start with a couple of axes. Let's start with the vertical axes here, actuality and possibility. In Bill's research, he discovered that every organization has an orientation to time that is either actuality focused, which means that it's more present focused. So in this organization, we are looking at months and years. It's a pretty short time frame. It has a transactional nature to it. And that's how we look at time. There's a pretty close relationship between idea and execution. Conversely, organizations can have an orientation to time that Bill called possibility focused. That's a very, very long-term focus. That's thinking in terms of decades and generations. Very long-term. So we incubate ideas in an organization that's possibility-oriented that have a pretty long time between idea incubation and execution. Popular example here would be the iPhone. It took 10 years to develop the iPhone, to put the first iPhone on the market. 10 years is a long time to be invested in generating an idea. An actuality-focused organization wouldn't spend near that amount of time. Much more transactional on the top of that continuum. All right, the horizontal continuum, personal or impersonal. This axis is dealing with the kind of information that an organization tends to trust when making a decision. The kind of information that an organization trusts when making a decision. So either we tend to trust personal kinds of information, anecdotal, or we trust impersonal, objective. Personal would be subjective. Impersonal information would fit on a spreadsheet. Personal information would not. If we take Yelp for the moment and we divide out the star rating or the reviews, we have 2 different kinds of information. If you're someone who pretty much skips the star rating, you see it, doesn't have quite the impact for you to decide, are you going to restroom A or restaurant B, you go down and you dive deep into the reviews. And you really trust what you're reading in the reviews. If that's how you decide between restaurant A or restaurant B, you tend to lead toward the left of this continuum. The subjective information carries a lot of weight for you. That may take too much time, one person's opinion, who cares, over another person's opinion. You're not someone who pays much attention to that. What does all that equal? Are they 4 out of 5 stars, 3 out of 5? I'm going to scan that, and I'm picking those that are 4.5 out of 5, and nobody else matters. If that's you, and it's the star rating that carries a lot of weight, you're on the impersonal side of the continuum. Both are valid kinds of information to make a decision. They're just 2 different kinds of information when making a decision. So if we put these axes together and we talk about an organization that is actuality focused, they're more near-term focused as it relates to time, but they use anecdotal information, we have what Bill called a customized customer promise. This is a customer promise that is going to spend time with its customer or client co-building a solution. So this would be a PR firm or a marketing firm. Very heavily customized. Very little comes off the shelf. This is very time-intensive and labor-intensive. And the relationship with the customer in building the solution is very deep and very intense. If you, again, think about a PR firm or a marketing firm. Think about a real estate agent. Transactional in nature. Bill and I want to go buy a building. We hire a real estate agent, and we sit down with that agent, and Bill and I know we want to spend X amount of money. We want to buy the building because we want to use the building for our own offices, or we want to buy the building because we want to have it as an investment opportunity. And we tell the agent that, and we talk with the agent, and we We argue a little bit about what we don't want to have as our offer price, but you get the point. Very customized approach as to what our offer will be, and we're relying heavily on the agent to work with us hand in hand to buy the building. All right, let's hop over to the upper right. We're still an actuality focused, transactional focused, but the kind of information that we use in this organization, this customer promise, is impersonal, fits on a spreadsheet. It's the stars out of the Yelp example. This organization is saying to its customer, come do business with us. We're not going to be flashy and sexy, but boy, you can count on us. We're going to be pretty much the same tomorrow that we were yesterday. This is an organization that is dependable, tried and true. This is an organization that has efficiency as one of the things that it is known for. This would be Walmart. This would be law enforcement. This would be the military. This would be, for example, the company that I work for. This is a company that says we are conservative by design. You rely on us because we are incredibly dependable. We are an organization that is going to preemptively see what the risk is, and we're going to get it taken care of before you ever have to think about it. Client, customer. We've got all that handled. All right, now let's go down below that personal, impersonal axes, and we have to the right, we have an organization that is possibility focused. That means it is long-term focused, years, decades, generations, long-term. And this organization says, come do business with us, and you're going to be part of an organization that is resetting the market according to the service or product that we deliver. Let me use the iPhone example again. There were other cell phones on the market by the time the iPhone was delivered. It was not the first cell phone on the market. Apple didn't care about being the first. And an organization that sits here doesn't have to be the first. They're just promising the customer, once we get to the marketplace, we will reset the standard. We will reset what it means to have a good cell phone. Now everybody's chasing us. Typically tends to be an organization that it's kind of costly to do business with them. Tesla, for example, would be another that would fit here. Harley-Davidson. This is not the commodity-oriented approach. This is heavy R&D. This is once we get to the market, we've reset the standard. So it tends to be expensive. Their service or product tends to be expensive because it's the elite. And by default, they have a high price to entry because they're not looking to do business with everyone. They're looking to do business with who can afford us. All right, now we're going to do the last customer promise. This is the customer promise that Bill called enrichment. This is a customer promise that is still very future-focused, possibility-oriented, as Bill called it, but they use personal, subjective, anecdotal kind of information to make a decision, and he called that enrichment. This would be a nonprofit, for example, that would fit this kind of customer promise. This would be education, for example, particularly higher ed. This would be, we have a nursing school, we want to help you as an individual realize your dream, your passion to be a nurse, to be a doctor, to be a fill in the blank. Come be with us for 4 or 5 years, and we will help you realize that dream. Tom's Shoes, any of you familiar with Tom's Shoes, would be an organization that fits here. And there's an organization, I don't now remember the name, that makes socks. And the reason that they do it is so that they can donate socks to homeless shelters and people in need. That would be an organization that would fit here. That would be their customer promise. So what you see here are 4 customer promises. We haven't even yet started into the culture part of Bill's work, but what he discovered is the first thing you have to answer is, what is our customer promise? At the core. If we had $1 left in the bank, we'd use the dollar to do X, That helps you answer the question of what is our core customer promise. And once you answer that, then you have by default, according to Bill's research, answered what culture you need, not want, but need to be successful in your marketplace. Bill's research showed, for those of you who are data-oriented and like to know these things, Bill's research showed if you get your culture in alignment with your customer promise, you will outperform your competitor in your marketplace, your market share, your longevity, all those things show you're positioned. If we just look at, if you were publicly traded, you're going to do about 70% better than your competition who isn't paying attention to this. So your share will sell roughly 70%, 70 cents on the dollar, better than your competition. When you think about culture, which is the second element that Bill researched in the 3 elements that are a part of every organization, and again, those 3 elements are culture, customer promise, and leadership. We've just reviewed customer promise, and Bill showed 1 of 4, and I'll go back for just a second and show you those 4 again. And let me speak to one last thing on this slide, and that is that you can see that the lines are dashed. They're not solid in between the 4 customer promises, and that is because while we are suggesting that you find the quadrant that you start in, we are not suggesting that you don't utilize the elements of the other 3 customer promises to make sure you are as strong as you can be. For example, let's look at the bottom left, customer promise. Let's put a nursery school. Preschool would fit into that customer promise. They're here to help you as you drop off Johnny and Sally. They want to make sure you as a parent want to make sure that Johnny and Sally are well cared for, that they get hugs during the day, that they have a good experience with finger paint and all kinds of things that will help mold their mind to be the most wonderful person they can be on the planet. Well, we would certainly tell that preschool that they better also pay attention to their accounting practices. And that would be in this, looking at these 4 quadrants, that would be as an organization, you make sure that you hire teachers who are very, very good at making sure that Johnny and Sally have a great day at preschool. But please make sure that you're paying attention to your books, your accounting practices and principles, and that would be borrowing activities from that upper right. That every single time 2 plus 2 equals 4, not 5. I had a client that fit into that bottom left quadrant, and they paid a whole lot of attention to their mission and very little attention to just the nuts and bolts of running a business, the accounting practices and principles and billing and that sort of thing. And he said to me as we were trying to make sure they didn't go out of business, we were all mission and no margin. Okay, I'll move on here. I think you get the point. We want to make sure that all of the elements of the other 3 customer promises and quadrants are incorporated into your business. Then as you make sure that you've identified the customer promise, you by default have the culture that you need. You need a culture that's in alignment to that customer promise. So the culture that a preschool needs, again, emphasis on needs, is very different than the culture that the United States Marine Corps needs. They fit in the upper right and a preschool fitting in the bottom left. The way we define culture is how we do everything. And I want to emphasize the word everything there. We want to make sure that everything we do within the 4 walls of our company, which is the culture, we want to make sure that everything we do is in alignment with delivering that customer promise. All eyes are turned toward delivering the customer promise as effectively as possible. And a few bullets here on further expounding on what we mean by everything are the bullets that you have in front of you. It's every decision you make. It's how you argue, how you agree, how you disagree, how you actually include the customer. A marketing firm would include the customer in a very different way than Apple does. There are two different customer promises and therefore two different cultures. The way you engage one another, the way you get results, the way you communicate, the way you inspire fairness, hire, fire, promote, the way you plan, the way you do everything is how we define culture. Another way to say this is customer promise is everything facing out. Culture is everything facing in. Bill, I'll pause for just a second. Is there anything that is coming up in questions or anything that you think of that we might need to touch on a bit more before we talk about the four cultures specifically?
Yeah, Sharon, great job so far. One of the questions we have here is, what is the single biggest mistake that companies make in trying to implement cultural change?
The single biggest mistake that a company makes when trying to implement culture change is they do not discuss how the change is going to help them deliver on the customer promise better than they've delivered on it in the past. In other words, they don't link the change to the customer promise. So they wind up with changes that tend to look more like flavor of the month. You know, tomorrow we can all expect that Amazon or someone is going to tell us about the next great book that the latest Facebook exec wrote. And then we'll all chase that and we'll all go figure out how do we implement that, or the Southwest way, or the Google way, or the Apple way. And we'll run around and we'll keep chasing all those ideas, as good as they may be, but we don't stop and find out how does that methodology, that idea, help us deliver on our customer promise better. And if we can't answer that question, it might be a change that we don't need to implement.
Well, that's a great answer. We have one other question, Sharon, with regards to this topic, and it first starts with a comment that says the title doesn't do a good job of defining culture or where it's located. Is this perceived or actual reality? And as a follow-up, do you have numbers or a study to back this up?
Sure. So I'd reference back then as part of the way to answer the question, admittedly, there are the topic of culture does tend to get confusing. It's one of the reasons that I particularly like Bill Schneider's research. It's because it is research. He spent about 15 years figuring out what the heck does this culture thing really mean, and in reality, should an owner, should a business person really care about it? Is it more than someone getting a birthday card on their birthday, or a pen because they've been with the company 5 years? Those things might be meaningful, but does it matter more than that? What his research showed is it actually matters to the effectiveness of the business in the marketplace. And again, the view here is that customer promise is everything looking out, the way we do the dealing with the customer. And culture is how we do everything that looks inward, whether that is literally inside literal four walls of a building or virtually, which tends to be more the case in this day and age. How we do all that we do internally. So I'll reference back then to this list. So everything from the ad that we place as we're trying to recruit, to the conversation we have in an interview, the conversation we have when we decide on the strategic plan, the conversation that we decide on which photocopier do we buy. It's pretty easy to imagine that culturally speaking, the photocopiers that we would recommend Walmart buy for their corporate office, or that they're going to use back in the break room in the Walmart stores, are very different kind of photocopiers that Google would buy. They ought to be different. Their customer promise is different, and therefore their culture should be different. So I just can't emphasize enough that the answer to what is culture, it's how you do everything internally. Every decision you make, how you function is the way we would define culture.
Makes a great deal of sense. We have other questions. I want to remind listeners that you can type your questions into the questions bar at the right, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. Great job, Sharon. Please carry on.
Sure, you got it. All right, let's go a bit more into the 4 cultures that link back to the 4 customer promises. So if we think again for a moment about the upper left, that customer promise says, come do business with us, and we're going to be very, very customized with you. We're a marketing firm, we're a PR firm, we're a real estate agent. So the kind of culture that is needed to deliver on that customer promise, Bill called that culture a collaboration culture. So internally in our organization, we are very collaborative with each other, just like we are collaborative with our customers. We're developing a marketing plan. So the culture here is one that says we actually don't care about title and tenure. If you've got a good idea, come tell us about it. We're developing a marketing campaign for Pepsi. Anybody's idea is welcome. Janitor, CEO, it does. Title, tenure doesn't matter. This is a culture that says this is a fairly flat organization. Again, it doesn't rely a lot on hierarchy. That tends in this culture to get in the way of decision making, to get in the way of good ideas. This is the only organization that as a decision-making methodology can use consensus. Shouldn't even be attempted in any other culture because they won't be able to do it. But this is a culture that needs to be constructed that deals very directly with conflict. They tend to just do it naturally. As you can again imagine, just the development of a PR campaign, sitting around a table, there's a lot of arguing that goes on, probably a lot of name calling. Depending on how direct people are, it could be a lot of profanity. They just go for it. And they're very direct and intense about it. Now let's move over for a second to the what Bill called the control culture, the predictable culture. This is a culture that does rely on hierarchy to make decisions. It's just think about the military. That would be an organization that would fit here. Law enforcement would fit here. Walmart would fit here. And that is an organization that does tend to be a hierarchically oriented organization. Absolutely fine. In fact, it's the kind of culture that I would suggest that they implement because that will help them deliver on their customer promise. This is a culture that is, by and large, delivering on things. You need to have a lot of cost containment. A lot of tough decisions have to get made. So this is a place in which hierarchy is helpful. The general, who tends to be someone who's very, very experienced, can make the tough decision. And typically the decision has a lot of weight to it, has a lot of, in the instance of law enforcement and the military, a lot of consequences, severe consequences to the decision. So that a decision-making rests typically more at the top, not exclusively. I'm not talking about zero empowerment, but that there is a hierarchy tends to be helpful here. And that would be the culture that we would recommend to go with a predictable, dependable customer promise. All right, now let's jump down to the bottom right. This is a competence culture that is in alignment with that best-in-class customer promise. I think Apple, Google, Tesla, all of those fit here. Again, this is a company that says, come do business with us. We certainly won't be the cheapest, but if you come do business with us, you're one of the cool kids. You're of the elite. That's what it means to do business with us. So internally, we want to make sure that we hire experts. Expertise matters here. Not so much hierarchy and tenure, but expertise. So if we're in a biotech research firm that would fit into this quadrant, we want to make sure we have as many biotech research experts as possible in this culture, because that's going to help us deliver on our customer promise best. You can imagine that the United States Marine Corps wants to make sure that it promotes up in its ranks those that are going to be the best, most decisive generals that they can get, because that helps deliver on the customer promise best. All right, now let me jump over to the last core culture, and that is what Bill called the cultivation culture. That fits with an enrichment customer promise. Again, this is an organization that says we exist in the world to make the world a better place. So Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, MAD, fits in this. A religious organization, a nonprofit, that's an organization that fits, and their customer promise is we're going to make the world a better place, or we're going to make you as an individual, we're going to help you realize your dreams. So internally, we need to make sure that we're organized, that our culture is one that is about the fulfilling of our dream and our mission. And if you're attracted to our mission, we want you to work here, because you will naturally have energy that will help us do the best job we can do in the marketplace. And so all of the ways in which we make decisions are guided by how do we make sure, if we're feed the children, how do we make sure that we feed 5 more children tomorrow than we fed yesterday? And we want everybody engaged in answering that question. And we have a culture that is oriented around that. Not necessarily organized around expertise as they would be over at our blue neighbors here on the right, but we are going to make sure we attract and keep and inspire, very inspiration-oriented in this culture. So this culture would want to make sure that it's weekly doing things that are all about making sure that you feel inspired to work here for the sake of the mission. So this would be an organization that would invest in inspirational quotes that you get in your inbox once a week, for example. All right, those are the 4 cultures that in Bill's research, he identified that map back to the customer promise. We now have 2 of the 3 elements. We've got core customer promise. That's the place to start when you want to talk about culture. What is my customer promise? When you've answered that, you have by default decided the culture that you need to deliver that customer promise best. And that takes us to the last element that Bill identified, and that is the element of leadership. And basically, when you boil down a leader's job description, you come up with 2 bullet points. Their job is to create the vision and direction of the organization and mobilize people to accomplish that. Create the leader, create the vision and the direction, and mobilize people to accomplish that. That is every leader's job in an organization. So once you have sorted out your core customer promise, then you know your core culture, then you want to get people leading in alignment with that core culture to help deliver on the core customer promise. Bill identified 4 basic leadership styles. On the upper left, we have the participative, and that's going to help make sure that we are highly collaborative, that we do the best job we can with our customer, that we are deeply connected to as we co-solution, because I, as a leader, very naturally, or I've learned to be very participative. This leader is someone who naturally is a pretty good coach. They're also someone that is very good at resolving conflict. They're a leader that goes directly into the conflict and finds ways to discuss it. They want to spend as much time as is needed to get the conflict resolved. Then we have what Bill identified as the directive leadership style, and that is someone who is fairly authoritative in nature. They're certainly firm, but they're also very assertive. You can certainly imagine this is that general that we talked about a moment ago, and this is someone who is very comfortable at making the tough decision. And there's someone who will say, let the consequence of the decision rest on my shoulders. And they'll rise up in protection of everybody on the hierarchy below them as the one who will say, it rests on me, I'm the one who did it. Then we have what Bill called the standard setter. That is the leadership style that is naturally and native to that lower right quadrant. This is a person who's very, very conceptual, very visionary, and I'm sure it's easy to imagine, Elon Musk and Tesla, several others. strong visionaries, not so very good at the tactical execution, but very good at the long-range vision. That's the natural leadership style that helps this organization be successful in the marketplace. And then we have on the bottom left, the last, we have the leadership style that Bill called charismatic. And this is someone who is very naturally, very easily gets people motivated and rally toward their vision, especially on that dark day when it looks like there's no way we can feed the 5 children we fed yesterday, much less 5 more. This is the person in the room, we all know them, that they're the ones who will get us inspired again. This is the one who says, just by their very nature of talking, they get us going, you know, that just again, kind of on that dark day, they're pretty good at helping us see the light. They just naturally connect one-on-one individually. And that's the leadership style that fits best into this customer promise. And I'm going to pause for 1 second and remind you of something I said earlier, and that is about the dashed lines not being dashed and not solid. You can certainly imagine that there are moments when that general that fits in that upper right quadrant has got to sit the troops down and be a very charismatic leader, has to employ that natural skill of the charismatic leader because they got to go do something tough tomorrow. That's an example of how the elements of each are needed in one. It's not an exclusivity. What we're meaning to suggest here, what I'm meaning to convey, is that you start in one of the quadrants, and then you figure out how to employ the elements of the other. So if the general was only giving pep talks and wasn't making those tough decisions, they'd be a pretty ineffective general. They just start. We're just looking at where we start, and then we'll figure out how to add the elements of the rest. So we've now covered the 3 elements of customer promise, which leads to what kind of culture do I need, and that leads to predominantly how do we all need to focus our leadership preferences. And now I'm going to show you an example of what it means to have the 4 different quadrants as it relates to power. How does each look at power differently? So the upper left looks at power as relationship power. If you want to find someone who naturally leads, has a learned or innate preference toward leading in a way that fits to this culture, go find someone in an organization who's well connected. I have someone that I know that fits naturally here, and at Christmas time, she gives away in the company she works for somewhere between 100 and 130 Christmas presents at work. She's extremely well connected. She's the one that when you need a favor, you go knock on her door because she knows 6 people in the company that can do it. She just naturally does it. She is powerful in her company because of the way in which she's connected. She doesn't have to work at it. She just does it naturally. Very genuine in her. And then on the upper right, we have power here that is looked at as role power, hierarchy. What is your title? Title would be another word I'd put for role. If you're in a meeting and there's 4 generals and 3 privates, we all know where the power rests, necessarily. Then we have expertise power in the bottom right. If we're in a meeting and it's the CEO, but in that meeting is the Nobel Prize winning biochemist for that company, power is going to rest for the Nobel Prize winning biochemist more than it will the CEO. We're all going to turn and listen to what the biochemist tells us more than we will the CEO. And then on the bottom left, power here is looked at as a belief power. The person in the room is the most passionate about feeding the children, is where power rests. They're going to infuse everyone with energy to accomplish the task at hand. The intent of this slide is to show that the 4 customer promises, and therefore the 4 cultures, look at power differently. And that is part of the reason that your core customer promise needs to guide and direct your culture. Not have your culture just figured out because of things we like or things we want or good ideas we have. Not a random attention to culture, but a very focused attention to culture. I'll pause here for a moment and go over a summary here quickly, and then happy to answer any questions you have. So a strong culture is needed to be successful, and the strong culture that is needed is the culture that is connected to your customer promise. And it's far more than what is your strategy. There are three elements to every enterprise: customer promise, culture, and leadership. And the one element that guides and directs the other two elements is the element of customer promise. So, Bill, I will pause and ask, are there any questions?
Well, yes, Sharon, great job. We do have a few questions here. Here's one that I'll just pose as it's written. Sharon, it seems like you're drawing a line between having the culture you want and the culture you need. Our company does a bit of both. If a company can do both well, what's the downside?
The downside is that you're less effective than you could be. If the customer promise is directing your decisions around culture, the research shows you will be stronger in your marketplace than if you don't do that. The more murky, the more mixed you are in your culture, certainly doesn't mean you're going to fail as a business. The issue is that you're less effective in the marketplace than you could be. Doesn't mean you aren't already powerful. It means that you will be more powerful. Bill's research showed that you will be more effective in your marketplace, and that is broken down into two things. More effective meaning your longevity in the marketplace is strengthened. You'll last longer. And the amount of the market share that you have will be greater. That's what I mean by effective. So if you focus on the culture that you need, again, which will be determined by your customer promise, you just increase your strength. Please don't hear me saying that you will be weak and go out of business if you don't. You will be stronger if you do.
Makes perfect sense to me.
Let me know, Bill, if there's anything on that comes back in the chat room for further clarity around that.
Okay. Now let's talk about, let's talk about sales cultures, which seem to be different animals. How do you balance values and performance in a sales team?
So you want to make sure that what the sales team is selling is what your customer promise is. So if, for example, if the sales force that is at Walmart, that is out in selling to manufacturers of goods and services, and they're out talking about why you should have your goods and services on the shelves at Walmart. If they're selling in the same way that the sales force at Tesla is selling, you can already immediately see a problem, because the sales force from the upper right quadrant, which is all about selling on, it's not that you're going to make, it's the long-term play. The sales force is focused on, we're conservative as an organization. You want to do business with us because we've mitigated risk. It's conservative. It's not the day trading. That's not why you would do business with us. It's the long-term play. That's what I, as a salesperson, am selling if I'm from the upper right. If I'm from the bottom right, conversely, so I'm a sales force that is much more about elite. It's going to be that, look, we're not low ticket here. It's going to cost you a lot, but you're going to be a part of the elite. You're going to be one of the cool kids. So if you need to pay bottom market prices, we're probably not the company you want to do business with. The sales direction, the sales focus is again guided by what is the customer promise, and they're selling something quite different. And we all have been a part of an organization where the sales team is promising one thing, and what the organization can easily deliver is another, And then we scramble and spend lots and lots of time to try and catch up to what the sales team is doing. Meanwhile, we're punishing the employees with overtime and all kinds of problems because we're not in alignment. What they're promising isn't what we're really in the market to deliver, and we're out of sync. By the way, high attrition happens when that happens. You have an attrition. Attrition will be one of the symptoms that that's going on.
Okay, we have another question about how important is understanding a company's culture during the interview process for applicants at all levels, entry, mid-level, and executive?
So extremely important, and if you could hear extremely and important in all capital letters, neon, and flashing. If you think back to that, one of the first slides, which was behavior equals person times the culture, very, very difficult to remove a problem employee in a culture. It's very difficult. More difficult in some organizations than others. Nonetheless, it's difficult. So the preventive measure around that problem is to recruit toward the culture. So it would be important in the interview and recruitment process, even before you get to the interview, all the everything that has recruited, been a part of the recruiting that's compelled someone to apply, needs to define, describe in every way possible the culture that exists, the culture that, or at least the culture you're striving to have, so that someone can already opt in or opt out. They can decide whether they even give you their resume or not, that you're already vetting for who fits here. And you can do that with the materials, the ways in which you market a job being open. And then once you sit in the room, that very intentionally the interview questions have been crafted to describe what it means to work in the organization, and that will solicit the answers to help the interviewers understand, am I talking to someone who is a better than not fit here? You know, we don't have the Garden of Eden in any organization, so this is degrees of fit. It's not a zero-sum game. I can give you an example. A friend of mine was working in a fairly conservative organization, an organization that was fairly large, that took quite a long time to make decisions. They fit into that upper right quadrant. Organizations that fit there do tend to do a lot of planning before they make a decision. They're pretty risk adverse. And she was working in the organization. She was an absolute misfit. She was someone who made pretty quick decisions. She was a pretty high octane, high intense person. She was fairly frustrated in the organization. So as she set out to find a better fit organization, she was interviewed by a tech company, much better fit for her. And she was interviewed. And in the interview, one of the people, the senior women, happened to be a woman in HR, was sitting in the interview, very casual-oriented interview, sitting in the interview, and please excuse the four-letter word I'm going to use here, but I'm going to quote directly. In the interview, they looked at my friend, her name is Kate, and said, Kate, look, this is how we do business here. We figure out, we design things, and we get through design, and even before we're implementing what we've designed, we blow that shit up and we start again. Kate knew she'd found home. She was talking to people that thought the way she did. How do we keep blowing it up? Start again. That's Kate. High wound up, high octane, never satisfied. She was a visionary. Nothing was ever good enough. She found home. She's still there today. And they vetted her to make sure she was someone who thought that way. Long-winded answer, but you can tell I have a lot of passion for. I would start recruiting for culture in the very first thing someone sees to know I have an opening in my company.
Excellent. Sharon, this is going to be our last question. And for this, could you advance the slide to our last slide, please, for your contact info? And the question is, yes, the corporate culture is stated on the internet. We've put it on written marketing, collaborative materials. But what measures and questions can you ask, or can we ask, to determine if they really get it past regurgitating what's stated, written, and accessible? Yeah.
Wow. And I'm gonna make an assumption here that the they that's being referred to are the employees, not recruiting candidates. Is that your hunch as well, Bill, from the question?
That's the way I read it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So I would risk a guess here that it's probably already known if the way in which we are behaving on a day-to-day basis is in alignment with what we've got posted on the mouse pad, on the website, on the whatever credenza we're using. My hunch is that the question comes from a place that says we unfortunately have a bit of a gap, maybe even a large one. The short way to say it is we're not quite walking our talk. So there are, one of the things we do with clients is we have a survey that gets at where are those gaps specifically between what what's presented on the website and what we're really doing day to day. I think most of the time, if we spend a little bit of time walking the shop floor, we'll get anecdotally, where we're missing the mark. I will tell you the ways in which there's a gap, the ways in which we have a mission statement, or the ways in which we're defining our culture, describing it, the ways in which we're not actually living it out. Whatever those things are, that list is the way in which we're giving up market share. It is absolutely, positively eating away in a nibble fashion. It's nibbling away, back to our very first slide, it is nibbling away at the strategy that is trying to be employed by the organization. It can't help but do that.
Sharon Diav-Insperity, thank you so much for sharing such great information, well stated, and your contact information is on the screen if people want to get in touch with you. Thank you again so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Vistage members, mark your calendars for some upcoming webinars. Friday, June 1st, 2018 at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Join Kathleen Quinn Vota, always a popular webinar leader, for Strategic HR, your secret weapon in the talent war. And you really want to draw a circle around this one. Friday, June 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, Vistage's own Chief Research Officer, Joe Galvin, and a guest panelist will discuss cyber threats and solutions for small and mid-sized businesses. This is Bill Black on behalf of Vistage Worldwide, wishing you continued success. This concludes today's webinar.